monitor your grades, but I have input all of your test grades and I have gotten a couple of submissions for the extra credit. So I'm updating the exams as I go. If you have not done that and you do wish to, remember that there is an assignment posted for optional extra credit for the test. They are CERs for the exam. I would say on the whole, a lot of you did really well. We had a couple of, I think, even hundreds on the exam, so I was very pleased. There was a small 10-point curve, so a lot of people who made A's got up right up there to the 100, so it's pretty cool. I did very well on the test. Keep in mind that we will have our next exam, not next week, but the week after that. We are going to finish evolution pretty soon. We are moving into, like I said, the evidence. So we are in our second day of evidence of evolution. We talked about the theory, we talked about biogeography, and then today we're talking about homologies. So by the end of the week, we should probably finish up with the evidence of evolution. And then next week, we're going to do some more with it. And then the week after that, we'll have our exam. Okay, so looking at our big slide, we have new vocabulary terms for the week. You'll see homologous, analogous, vestigial are of important note because that's what we're talking about today. I have another star question to practice on today. Our key points are going to, of course, be distinguishing between those different structures. We'll talk more about it, of course, as we go on. Your independent practice is homework if you don't finish it, and then there's your CK through 12 readings. Haven't changed all week, and they shouldn't change. Okay, let's go ahead and move into our do now. So we're looking for answers in the chat. We're not looking for the incorrect response, looking for the correct response. I'm going to give you about 3 minutes for this one. Oh, you can't hear it. Oh, there it is. That's okay, Gila. We'll go back to the objective here in a second. Also, I'm sending you a private message. There you go. I'm seeing F's in the chat. Thank you all for paying respect. Insider gamer reference.
F in the chat, boys.
Maybe that's a little bit easier to read.
Oh yeah, Mr. Raymond, my answer will be F.
Okay. Rasta says J. Hugo says G several times. F. F for Eddie, F for Melanie, F for Grace. Caitlin says laugh out loud funny. All right, a little less than a minute. Just a few more responses. We're almost at 100%. Good point, Zarya. All right, so that was time. Hopefully this question looked very familiar, right? Because this was part of your independent practice yesterday. I wanted to touch back on it because I didn't quite get to finish everything I was talking about with um, gradualism and punctuated equilibrium. So I wanted to make sure that we address this one more time. All right, so I saw lots of Fs. Does anybody want to come off chat and explain why they chose F?
I can.
Go for it.
So I chose F because it made the most sense because um the G didn't make very much sense because the new species wouldn't like breed like that just out of nowhere because it wouldn't be that big of a change that fast. And the change over time wouldn't make sense either because they wouldn't have any reason to adapt them. And then J wouldn't make any sense because the there wasn't those other species that they could like breed with, and it wouldn't be that big of a change. So F was like the only one that would make sense with such like a big change out of nowhere.
All right, everybody give Brighton 2 snaps. That was excellent. He broke down all the other answer choices and why they were incorrect. Man, Brighton, perfect. That was wonderful. So yeah, as we have talked about, F is the correct answer. So the mollusks were well adapted to their stable environment, but then a large, sudden change occurred in the environment, and then after that change, mollusks with the bigger shells were better adapted for the new environment. So we're looking at this picture. We see two types of shells, right? There's these small shells, there's these big shells, and then some kind of rapid change that happened. This is talking about punctuated equilibrium. I didn't get a whole lot of chance to talk about this yesterday. This is kind of like I was really, really close to the exit ticket. I wanted to give y'all plenty of time to work on it. But this is that last little bit of what we wanted to talk about yesterday. So you can see gradual changes over time, like we saw with the finches, or you can get this punctuated equilibrium, which is where there's like this big thing that happens, and then suddenly like they have to kind of adapt to it. So you have these long periods where you see these straight lines that are called stasis. So actually I put a picture here. So when you see the stasis, they're all kind of the same, right? In gradualism, what you'd expect to see would be like noticeable changes over time, like how this beak takes that shape over a long period. Same thing down here, right? So the finches that we saw in Darwin's Galapagos Islands, right? That's what we noticed. We noticed that there were these large beaks and small beaks, and there was evidence of these medium-sized beaks. So there was like a gradual shift in time. However, in punctuated equilibrium, something happens that forces change. So it doesn't mean that the animals are necessarily changing their genes. It just means that the ones that are better adapted, the ones with those genes, are the ones that survive and reproduce. And there's such a big drop off that you don't see a whole lot of other fossils in the fossil record. So, with punctuated equilibrium, you have long periods of things staying the same, and then suddenly something happens where there's a change that happens. So, like with these shells, something happened to make them go from small to large because whatever was happening environmentally, the large shells were better adapted to survive than the small shells. Okay, let me check the chat. Are there any questions about that? It's okay, Faye. That's why I wanted to go over it now because I wanted to make sure that we all kind of understood what was happening.
But why do they call it gentilism?
Say again?
So why do they call it grandilism?
So gradualism has to do with things slowly changing over time. So notice how in this graph things just kind of go from one to the next very kind of smooth. So when you look at this picture, see how the beaks, you can kind of trace how it goes from, this to this to this to this, like it all kind of lines up, as opposed to this one down here where it starts out small and then it just jumps to being big. Maybe something happened in the environment that selected that larger beak to more advantageous. So then suddenly you don't see any of those intermediary species because they couldn't survive, they all died. Only the ones with that trait that was favorable were the ones that survived and reproduced. So it wasn't gradual. It didn't happen slowly. It happened quickly. That doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. It just means that these are two different types of things that can happen.
Okay, I understand that. I understand.
Okay. All right, I'm not seeing any other questions. So I'm going to move on. Like I said, I was wrapping up from yesterday. Another reminder, I'm a little slow to do it, but I am posting those videos in YouTube. Just a reminder, there is a link for the playlist in the general tab. Again, not monetized, not trying to promote myself. It's just there for you guys. Okay, another reminder about your optional extra credit. I have put your test grades into the gradebook. If you want to increase your grade, there is optional extra credit. Optional means it's not required. You don't have to do if you don't want to. Like I said, a lot of y'all got hundreds, which I'm very happy about. And a lot of y'all did really well. But this is really for people who really want a chance to bring up their grade because we are approaching the end of our grading period pretty soon. The next test is probably not going to be on this grading cycle. So we have two summative grades. We have our Unit 1, our mid-Unit 1 exam from a couple weeks ago, and then our unit exam that we just had. So those will be your two test grades. Everything else is going to be formative. Okay, if you are doing the extra credit, it is due on Friday. So Friday at 4 p.m. is the cutoff. After that, I won't be taking it anymore because they do take a long time to grade, and I'm not going to give you forever to work on it because part of being in high school means you have to keep yourself accountable. You have to stay on top of your stuff. And so it's important to make sure that you're doing all that. So Gigi, here you go. Here's the objective. Can someone come off mute and read this for us?
I can read it.
Go for it.
Students will be able to describe various types of evidence for common answering, including homologous, analogous, and best. What does that say?
Vestigial.
Vestigial, vestigial structures.
So I hope what this shows you is that, again, biology has a lot of vocabulary terms, right? So we're looking at homologous, analogous, and vestigial structures today. We're using this to kind of go back to using it for the evidence of evolution to show common ancestry. Okay, so we're going to watch a video real quick.
Stated Clearly presents, what is the evidence for evolution? The theory of biological evolution makes two very bold claims about living creatures. First, all living things on Earth are related. They evolved from a common ancestor. Second, the evolution of living things is powered by natural processes, things which can be studied and understood. But is there really any evidence that these two claims are true? Yes. There are so many observable facts from so many different fields of study that the only way we can even begin to talk about them is to group them into categories or lines of evidence. To keep things simple, here we'll focus on evolution's first claim that all living things on Earth are related. We cannot tackle the entire tree of life at once. After all, there's an estimated 8.7 million species alive today. So instead, we'll focus most of our attention on one fairly small but fascinating branch of the evolutionary tree, cetaceans. This branch includes whales, dolphins, and porpoises. Biologists tell us that all these creatures are closely related, and that the entire group evolved from an ancient four-legged land mammal. Instead of taking their word for it, let's look at the facts. We'll start by looking at a few from the field of comparative anatomy, the study of differences and similarities between living things. Whales live in water, and from a distance, they sort of look like giant fish. A close inspection of their anatomy, however, tells us a very different story. Whales, just like land mammals but unlike fish, have placentas and give live birth. They feed milk to their young. They are warm-blooded, which is extremely rare for a fish. And whales do not have gills. Instead, just like us, they breathe air with two fully developed lungs. Whales don't seem to have noses like mammals do. Instead, they breathe through blowholes coming out the tops of their heads. Some whales have two blowholes which almost look like nostrils, but dolphins and porpoises only have one. Surprisingly, if you look at their skulls, you find that the blowhole splits into two nasal passages inside the head. Could it be that the blowhole is actually a highly modified mammal nose? It looks that way, but we'll need more evidence to be sure. Many whales have hair, just like land mammals. In this photograph, you can actually see the whiskers of this baby gray whale as he rests his chin on mama's back. Strangely, whales have arm, wrist, hand, and finger bones inside their front flippers. Here's a photo of these bones, the same bones that bats, hippos, and people have in their front appendages. one bone, two bones, wrist, hand, and finger bones. Modern whales do not have back legs, but they do have a strange pair of bones where the hind legs should be. Here's a picture of these bones from a bowhead whale. They almost look like shriveled hip, thigh, and shin bones. This one even has a ball and socket joint between the hip and thigh bone, just like the ball and socket joint in your own hip. Is this resemblance a mere coincidence, or are these real leg bones? Perhaps leftovers from the whale's evolutionary history. Before we draw any bold conclusions, let's see if a completely separate line of evidence will confirm our suspicions. Embryology is the study of how creatures develop before being born or hatching from a...
Okay, oops, sorry. Before we move into embryology, I wanted to make sure that we all understood what was happening. So a big part of what we're doing today has to do with homologous structures.
Stated clearly presents.
Oh, I can't do it.
What is...
I can do it here, I think.
Stated clearly.
Yeah. So these are what homologous structures are. So between the whale fin and the human arm, you can see that there are similarities, right? They have the exact same bones. And I think I might have stopped sharing. No, I'm still sharing. So what that means is they point to a common ancestor. This is what we mean by lines of evidence, right? Things that prove the theory of evolution. Again, it doesn't make it a fact. It doesn't make it, like 1,000% true. It's a theory that we have based on the evidence that we see. So we are going through these lines of evidence. So we can see when we're looking at these bones that they resemble mammalian characteristics, like with the blowholes, right? They have that nostril-looking thing that you see on skulls sometimes, right? That's not something that you see in fish because fish have gills. They don't have lungs the same way that we do. And like I mentioned in the video also, that the whales have a placenta and they give birth to these, these offspring, unlike, a fish that usually lay eggs, right? So there's all these different lines of evidence that show that whales are not fish. They are actually mammals. Okay, let's get back into it.
Mammals.
These Martinez.
Or are these real leg bones?
What did that mean? Like after, like I don't know, another million years, that whales would turn into fully developed fish, or were they still mammals?
So they're in a whole different kind of kingdom. I don't know if you remember when we talked about taxonomy, how we had the 6 different kingdoms. So I guess they're in the same kingdom, sorry, because they're both animals, but they're in different kingdom final class. They're in different orders, or maybe even different families. So hypothetically, you are right that as time goes on, the whales will become more and more adapted to ocean life. So like when we're looking here at these hip bones, right? The hip bones probably had legs attached to them at some point, but there's no legs there anymore. Because as time goes on, it makes less and less sense for those things to be there. Think of it as like amount of money, right? You only have X amount of dollars to go shopping. Your body does the same thing with energy. It only has so much energy to devote to things and resources. So as time goes on, your body's going to devote less and less energy to things that are not useful. These are called vestigial structures. So these are things that no longer serve a purpose. So for us, it's like tailbones. Like whenever you hit your butt on the pavement and you feel that really sharp pain just above your butt, right? That's where the tailbone is. That's because a long time ago, our ancestors had tails. And so you look at the bones, you can kind of see the beginnings of a tail. And sometimes, some people are even born with little notches, like little mini tails. Because again, a long, long time ago, our ancestors had that. So part of that is encoded into our DNA. But we don't need that, right? A reason the primates have tails are because they need them for balance, like whenever they're in trees. So our ancestor a long time ago probably lived in trees. They needed that to balance, but we don't live in trees anymore, right? We walk on our 2 legs. We don't really use our arms to get around much. So we have all the balance that we need right there. Now, the thing isn't totally gone, very similar to this whale having these pelvic bones. Eventually, it would also disappear. So your question about fish and whales, they will become more and more alike, but they will always have different ancestors. They'll always be different.
Mr. Martinez,
Uh-huh.
you said whale aren't fish. Are they are mammals or they aren't mammals?
They are mammals.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Martinez, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the like what they said looked like a hip bone? Is that connected to the rest, or is it just like floating there, or like
It's
not
just
there?
yeah, it's just floating. It's not really connected to anything.
It's not. Oh, okay.
Nope. It just floats in there. You kind of see how the edges are a little bit rounded off. These are not cut. This is just how the bones kind of form. They're just misshapen because they don't connect to anything else. Our hip bones kind of float a little bit, right? Because they connect to our scapula, not scapula, to our vertebral column, right? So our backbone goes all the way down, and then there it connects to our pelvic bone, and the pelvic bone then connects to the legs. So it is just kind of there supporting all that middle weight. So in a whale, there isn't that same kind of gravity, right? There's nothing there to kind of help it keep everything together. So it just kind of floats there, and eventually it'll go away, just become nothing. Not in that whale, but in that whale population over time, right? As time goes on and on and on, this bone will become less and less pronounced and less present because it serves no purpose. Okay?
Oh, okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Perhaps leftovers from the whale's evolutionary history. Before we draw any bold conclusions, let's see if a completely separate line of evidence will confirm our suspicions. Embryology is the study of how creatures develop before being born or hatching from an egg. Here we see a dolphin and a human embryo side by side at similar stages of development. Notice that they both have what look like arm buds and leg buds. In humans, the leg buds grow to become legs. In whales, they grow for a while but then stop, effectively fading away as the rest of the whale continues to grow.
I keep forgetting I can't press spacebar. So if you've never seen that before, that weird looking creature thing is a person, right?
In humans,
So this is what it looks like when we're just like being created. So we'll talk more about it when we get to reproductive structures. But what happens is, I know this is adult talk, we've talked about it before. The sperm cell and the egg cell join together, right? To make a baby. It forms what's called a zygote. Just two cells, like tiny microscopic things that you can't even see with the naked eye. They join together and they start dividing and dividing and dividing. And this is what you get after a little bit. So this is very, very early on in the development process. But this is what we look like, very, very, very tiny. So you can't deny there's a lot of similarities between the way they look. So that's what's called with embryology. So when we're embryos, when we're, still growing.
the leg buds grow to become legs. In whales, they grow for a while but then stop, effectively fading away as the rest of the whale continues to grow. These are all photographs of a common dolphin at different stages of growth. Notice that early on, we see two nostril grooves on the front of the face, just like you'd expect in a puppy or a human. As the dolphin continues to grow, the nostrils migrate to the top of the head and fuse together, becoming the dolphin's blowhole. So far, we have multiple facts from two independent lines of study, comparative anatomy and embryology, that are both telling us the same story. The ancestors of whales were once four-legged land creatures. Will the fossil record act as a third witness, confirming this idea? These are two species of extinct basilosaurid whales. These animals are known for multiple well-preserved skeletons, and they appear to have lived side by side, roughly 34 to 40 million years ago. In this photograph, we're looking down at the top of a basilosaurid skull. This is not a model or a cast. These are the actual bones which were pulled from the ground. Notice that the
Question:
nasal opening is not on the top of the head like those.
Yeah.
how do they know how long ago a fossil or an animal lived?
So that is a physics question and it has to do with something called carbon dating. So what happens is there's certain elements like carbon that eject protons at a certain rate. And so what they do is they look at the I guess here are the bones, and they examine the carbon to see how many protons have been ejected, and they can backwards track how old it is. So it's a fairly complicated process, but what they're doing is they're looking at the actual molecules and judging the amount of time that has passed, and that's how old they know something is.
Um,
And then Casey brought up a good point. Why does the late fetus dolphin look like a bird with no eyes, Like, does it just turn gray magically over time? I'm lost. So, what happens is when you're looking at these embryos, let's see if I can rewind back to it. So this is not a fully formed creature, right? This is still in the process of being made. So when you look at a finished creature like this dolphin, you see its skin, all of its organs are nice and tucked inside, everything is well put together, right? The fetus is in such early stage of development that there is no inside or outside. That doesn't mean that there's going to be gray stuff on the inside. It just means that the skin is not even fully formed yet. What happens is there's a protein called melanin, right? It's what produces color in our skin. It's what gives all these different colors that we have now. Same thing in the animal kingdom, right? It's a reaction to the amount of light that we get. So sometimes it's genetic, sometimes it's environmental, but the point is that once you're born, or even I guess even before you're born, your body starts to produce pigments based on whatever's coded in there. So those dolphins probably have a certain pigment coded into their DNA that will be produced eventually. But again, these fetuses that you're seeing are so early in development. They're still being developed. Like they're like when it's talking about that blowhole, what we're looking at here is like a mix between muscle and bone. Like the muscles and bones are not even fully formed yet. Even the nerve fibers, like the thing that connects everything together, is still in the process of being made. So it takes a long time for it to come to a final like form.
How does a dolphin get its color?
So, like I was saying, there's a specific sequence in your DNA, and I guess in their DNA, that codes for color. Like I said, it's called melanin. And so, what that does is that it produces a certain kind of pigment that is what creates that illusion of color. Because really, a color is just what's bounced back from light, which again is another physics concept that's not important. But it's a reaction to light and how light bounces off of our skin and off of other things. It's why plants are green because of chlorophyll, right? It's the pigment that makes them green. For us, it's melanin, and I'm sure there's something very similar to dolphins because we're also mammals. But yeah, it's so there's a gene coded inside their DNA that will create that color later on. Okay. All right, let's get back to where we were. Basilosaurus.
Multiple well-preserved skeletons, and they appear to have lived side by side roughly 34 to 40 million years ago. In this photograph, we're looking down at the top of a basilosaurid skull. This is not a model or a cast. These are the actual bones which were pulled from the ground. Notice that the nasal opening is not on the top of the head like those of modern whales, and not at the end of the snout like those of land mammals. Instead, it's right in the middle. This is an intermediate species, exactly what evolution tells us.
Okay.
At the end of the
So, Denise brings up a good point. Very long spine. If you've never been to a museum before, some museums of natural history have like these giant whales that you can kind of step into. You'll be amazed at how big whales are, especially these basilosaurs, because these basilosaurs are actually bigger than the whales are now. But I think the largest whale known to man right now is called the sperm whale. And I was in a museum, I think, in Washington, D.C., and they had this giant whale that you could like look at. You are so minuscule compared to a whale. You are not even as big as one of its teeth. Like they are so ginormous. Anyway, the reason I wanted to pause here, look at these skulls, right? Think about what we just talked about with gradualism and punctuated equilibrium. Does anybody know what it is that we're looking at here with regard to this blowhole? Like, are we looking at gradualism or are we looking at punctuated equilibrium?
Um, are we looking at gradualism?
Very good, Brandon, right? Because we're seeing that slow change over time. So with this with this modern whale, you see that the blowhole's all up here at the top, right? And then if you go further back in time, here it is in the middle, and even further back in time to a common ancestor, you see it's all the way down here with the coyote. So what happened is that over time, it kind of graduated up. So a long time ago, there was even though this is a coyote, it represents like early mammals. So there was a mammal on land that had that, blowhole up front, like a nose. And then slowly over time, it went further and further up. It kind of makes sense because, if you're in the ocean and you're swimming along, you want that blowhole to be up top, right? You don't want it out front. But it shows you that gradualism, that slow change over time, that evolution that it is that we're talking about.
the snout like those of land mammals. Instead, it's right in the middle. This is an intermediate species, exactly what evolution tells us we should find. At the back end of a basilosaurid's body, there are small, yet fully developed hips, legs, ankle, feet, and toe bones. These legs are far too small for walking on land, but they may have been useful while mating or for scratching away parasites and itchy skin. Evolutionary theory tells us that the further we go back in time, the harder it should be to distinguish whales from normal land mammals. Meet Myocetus. The hip bones of Myocetus seem sturdy enough to walk on land, but this animal is considered to be a whale for many reasons. Their skeletons have all been found among fossils of sea creatures, which tells us they lived in the ocean. Their short legs, combined with long, flat fingers and toes, suggest they were strong swimmers with webbed hands and feet. Here we see the bottom side of a Myocetus jaw and skull. Her teeth match those of the basilosaurid whales we saw earlier, and the unique structures of her middle ear bones match those of basilosaurid whales and modern whales. Myocetus appears to be a walking whale. Scientists have found the fossils of many ancient whale-like mammals and continue to find more. Together, these fossils blur the line between four-legged land mammals and fully aquatic modern whales, solidifying the idea that whales indeed evolved from land creatures. Now let's look at a fourth line of evidence,
Okay.
DNA.
Actually, I'll
DNA molecules contain chemical codes which act like recipes for living things. Without ever looking at bones, embryos, or anatomy, researchers can compare the DNA code of different living creatures to find out who is most closely related to who. Whale DNA has been compared to all kinds of other animals, fish, sea lions, you name it. And so far, the closest genetic match is to the pudgy, water-loving hippopotamus. This does not mean that whales evolved from hippos, but if this genetic finding is correct, whales and hippos both evolved from a common ancestor that lived roughly 54 million years ago. At first, the link between whales and hippos surprised researchers because whales are mainly carnivores. They eat things like fish and small crustaceans.
Okay, I actually want to pause there and move on to something else. So the biggest line of evidence that we're using for building these phylogenetic trees, the things we were looking at the other day that look at how closely things are related, we can look at the biogeography, like we talked about yesterday. We can look at the fossil record, but then we also have our DNA evidence. So like I said a second ago, the DNA between a whale and a hippo are very, very close. Again, doesn't mean that they are super closely related, but it does mean that they share a common ancestor a long time ago. And this gets into the evidence about how they did that. We'll talk more about that later. So I wanted to quickly overview everything that we just talked about.
Aren't hippos also carnivores?
They are. Okay, let me
Or are
stop.
they omnivores?
I think hippos are. Actually, no, I don't actually know. I know that whales are definitely carnivores, right?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I'll find out the answer for you, and I will figure that out later. Let me get to this thing, homology. Okay, let's quickly recap all the things that we did. So when we're talking about homology, the important thing to remember is homology means similar characteristics among species that serve the same function. So I know it sounds silly, but the prefix homo in Latin means same. So homology, we're looking at same things, similar characteristics. So like I showed you earlier with all these different bones, they all have the same bone pattern. Right, you kind of see how it kind of squishes and moves depending on the function of various appendages. So anatomical homology, organisms with similar anatomical patterns came from a common ancestor. So even though they might not be in the same environment, they all share the same bones, means they all probably share the same DNA, means they all probably share the same common ancestor. We saw this with the embryos. Everything at the beginning kind of looks very similar, even though they are very spread apart. But when we look at how the organisms are forming, it's undeniable that they share a lot of commonality. Yeah. You can also look at cells, right, between even plants and animals. It would stand to reason that a long time ago, there was some kind of protocell or first cell that animal cells and plant cells kind of split off from. And like I said a second ago with the DNA, right, molecular homology, you can kind of see how things are the same. We'll talk more about this when we get into our genetics unit, but we can use it to kind of determine paternity, like who's the dad. You can figure out a crime scene based on the DNA evidence, right? You have blood at the crime scene, you compare the blood samples to everybody, see where the DNA lines up, and odds are if it's the same DNA, it's a match. Okay. Homologous structures. So, homologous structures are, like I said, structures that are in different species because they were inherited from a common ancestor. So the thing that I like to think of is that they share the same form, but they have a different function, right? So between a human and a cat, right, they're not doing the same thing. So they look different. Does anybody want to guess why the cat bones are different than the human bones?
Mr. Martinez, I have a question.
Uh-huh.
It's back to your hippo topic. Can hippos drown? Because you said they're related to whales.
I believe hippos can drown.
Okay. And can
And for the
dolphins
record, I
drown?
think that whales can also drown.
Dolphins can also drown if they stay underwater for a long time because the blowhole basically gives them oxygen,
Mm-hmm.
which
Yeah.
they need. So if they don't get it and if they stay underwater enough, they can drown.
Yeah, so one of the biggest predators of whales, and even though it might be weird to think about because whales are so big, there's something kind of just as big, if not bigger, depending on your definition, but these colossal squids. So think about like your calamari squid, right? Like it's like that, but times like a billion. And so what happens there are these colossal squids, they entangle the whales and they drag them down. And so, like I said a second ago, the blowholes are there because they have lungs, right? They need to get oxygen. They can go a long time without breathing, but they do need to breathe. And so, what these colossal squids do is that they attack them. They kind of sink in their, I forget what they're called, but they're like these spikes, and they drag the whale down and it suffocates and drowns. So, just because they live in water doesn't mean that they can't suffocate.
Wait, would cat and human bones be different because I'm just reading the definition. Their structures were inherited from different common ancestors?
From the same ancestor, but I would say that they have different functions, right? Like, what do we do with our arms for the most part?
Grab and touch.
Yeah, we
Slap.
grab stuff. We use tools. We manipulate things with our fingers, right? Whereas a cat doesn't really use tools, right? You can't even really play catch with a cat. It doesn't do a whole lot. Those bones are specialized for like landing on their feet, right? You see how all the stuff is kind of curved and supports this area right here? It's because it's trying to make sure that all the pressure is there so that whenever it lands on its feet, it can kind of, you know, jump back up. So these bones are developed for that. They're designed to run. They're designed for impact. They're predator looking bones.
Wait, why did
Question: Are the cat's claws their bones or is it something else?
They're extensions of like look at your fingernails. That's essentially what their claws are. So they have finger bones and they have projections coming out of it, which are like nails.
when you stare at the animal's bones this way, they all look like they have long hands, just different lengths?
Because they do. These are essentially long hands of different lengths. Like look at the bat, right? The bat has like these crazy looking fingers. And even though you might not think of it, they are fingers. They're just kind of attached by a wing. The bats have claws so that they can like catch things and put them in their mouth like fruits or little animals, but they are essentially hands. Again, these are all mammals, right? They all are in the same kingdom Mammalia. I'm sorry, not kingdom Mammalia. They're in the same animal kingdom, but they are all mammals.
What are the webbed fingers for? Like how the bat has like webbed fingers.
Mhm.
What are they used for? What is their main
So
purpose?
that's to catch air, right? So there's a principle called the Bernoulli effect, which is what allows flight to happen. And so the reason the bats have these webbed fingers is so that they can catch air and force it and then allow them to kind of lift. Same thing with the whale. It's not necessarily webbed in the same way, but it has skin that goes across. That way it can kind of have a larger surface area to push against the water and propel them forward.
Oh.
So again, homologous structures. They all have the same form, but different functions. Then we get to analogous structures, which have the same function, but different forms. So the classic example here are birds and insects, right? So both are wings that are there to help them fly, right? But bird wings and insect wings are crazy different, right? Can anybody think of a big difference between a bird wing and an insect wing?
A bird wing is more like kind of has like edges, like kind of like the parrot. It has like edges at the end,
Mm-hmm.
and an insect wing just round and it separates into two in each side.
Yeah,
I was
very
gonna
good.
say that bird wings are thicker.
That's true. What else? What else do they have that insects don't?
Feathers.
Sir,
Yeah, feathers.
bones. They
They got
have
feathers
bones, right?
and bones. Very good. Right. All these
Let's
different things.
go.
Very good. Right.
I'm
They
not
both help them
educated.
achieve flight, but they definitely have different forms. Right.
What
Different forms, same function. So opposite from the homologous. And then finally, we talked
what are
about
the antennas for in an insect?
help them sense their environment so they can kind of see better. And I think to communicate. I think. And then finally, vestigial structures we talk about a lot. Those are things that don't have a function anymore. So like this pelvic bone in the whale didn't do anything right. They don't have legs anymore. A long time ago, their ancestors did, but current whales don't. There's a lot of different examples of this. So for example, the appendix, you hear about people getting their appendix removed. It's an organ inside of us that has an unknown function. We don't know what it does. Maybe a long time ago it helped us eat leaves. We don't know, but it's an organ that kind of just takes up space, doesn't do anything for us, and sometimes it gets infected. You got to take that thing out. It's a vestigial structure. So structures that used to be important, but they're now useless. Also tailbones, that sort of thing. Yeah. Okay. All right. Oof, that was a sprint. I still didn't have as much time as I wanted to for us to have time for your independent practice. Thankfully, it's not too difficult, but I would like to go ahead and jump forward into our exit ticket because I like that you guys have time to do it. I think whenever I give you more time to finish it, more people are able to get it done. But the independent practice is essentially what we've been talking about. It's looking at homologous structures, analogous structures, and vestigial structures as we continue to kind of dig into the evidence for evolution. So before we get to the exit ticket, are there any questions? I don't see any. Okay, I'll go ahead and put the link into the chat. The assignment is already posted, so if you do want to go to the assignment and do it that way, that's fine. Give me 1 second and I'll copy the link and put it into the chat box. There you go. Thank you guys for your participation today. Like I said, there is no intervention this week, so when we're done here, you can definitely log off and get to your homework. I would encourage you to stay logged on and work on your independent practice. That way you don't have to worry about doing it for homework because it won't take you too long. It's not difficult. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, yeah, Gila, that's what you got. Okay. Puppies. But let me know if you have any questions. I will monitor the form submission so I can let you know who needs to go after y'all have turned it in.
Sir, I turned in my exit ticket.
Thank you, Mizari. I'll check here in a second. And then
Mazzari.
again, what did I say? Did I say Mizari? Or did I say something else?
You said Mizari.
Oh, sorry. So here's something not fun for y'all to hear. Or I guess I mean not funny. So my wife she's been in America for a long time, but she is Filipino. So she does have like tiny accent. And so they put emphasis on the wrong syllables. And so she likes to make fun of it by saying she puts the emphasis on the syllables. And so every now and then I find myself struggling with a couple of words, putting emphasis in the wrong place, just because I've been trying to practice my Tagalog. Anyway, so Ma'aza'ara, that's why I have such a hard time pronouncing your name, is because of that. Okay, so let me pull up my form and I can tell you who's done. Yeah, my Filipino peeps know what's going on. Okay, like I said, you guys did great today. And the X tickets, okay, let me say it's a good thing yesterday. Yesterday I had 80% exit ticket completion, which is amazing. So thank you guys. Thank you so much trying to get that up. I would love 100%, but again, I'm really happy that you guys are turning in the exit tickets. And I meant to say earlier, one more reminder for your optional extra credit for the test. I have put your test into the grade book. If you want that extra credit, please get it done before Friday at 4, right? That's when it's due. After that, I won't be looking at them because, like I said, they're very hard to grade. So you have 2 more days to get them finished.
Finished. I did the other ticket.
Thank you, Gabriel. So I'm going to refresh this now, and I will start reading off names. Who's done? Again, no intervention. You guys are good to go. It's Thursday. Tomorrow's Friday. Man, we did it. So great. Actually, let me stop recording real quick because I keep forgetting to stop recording.
Bye.